Welcome to show 59 of Silver Lining for Learning. This is a special show. They're all special shows, but it's got a little special twist on this one. And so we'll talk about that in a second. We've got 4 guests with us today. 2 co-authors of a new book that's come out on universal design for learning with Routledge. It had like 90 contributors to like almost 50 chapters. And we have 2 of their authors with us today from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, as well as someone from Santiago, Chile. So we'll hear from Marcia, and we'll hear from Boris Alvarez, and Marcia Lanier, and you'll have to help me with the last name.
Line Cleophas.
Thank you. We also have Susie Gronseth with us from the University of Houston. Go Cougars, yay! But not only that, she's an alum of my program at Indiana University, and she just got the Outstanding Alumni Award. Yay for that too.
Change.
How are you?
Wear your own costume underneath that.
So yes, I do have something else. No.
Yeah, right. Be careful.
Yeah.
I have my tennis shoes that are red and black for Cougars and Indiana both. So yeah, so I'm fully dressed as Indiana or Houston. The wardrobe works. We also have Betsy Dalton from the University of Delaware, who's going to send me clothes after this event, and I'll send you my address. So
Rhode Island.
Actually, I'm in Rhode Island. It's a
it's close.
Coast on the East Coast.
So we have, yes, you can see a lot of humor in this show, and we're going to have a lot of seriousness as well. I'd like to have a bit of time here for Susie and Betsy to talk about how they ended up collaborating together and how they got into the field of UDL. What got each of them interested or in this, and how's their perspectives changed over time? So Betsy or Susie, you want to start us off?
Betsy, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's great to be here with everyone. And yeah, I guess I'm kind of the senior person of the group here, since I've been in the field of special education for more than 40 years. And it was really my interest in working with individuals and children and adults with challenges that brought me to recognize UDL. I was working at Rhode Island College and became aware of universal design for learning and started working with it in 2005. We were working with teams of teachers and the Department of Education, and also all of the university. We have 3 state universities, and we had representatives from all of those universities working as in teams to learn about universal design for learning, and then to work to try to implement it. And we developed a checklist on universal for teachers to use in the classroom to observe for UDL and everything like that. But and then a number of years later, after I finished my PhD, I had a great opportunity to work in a fellowship, a UDL fellowship with CAST, and also at Boston College. So I spent a year up at BC and CAST, kind of immersed in UDL, and then brought that back and started to integrate it with the other things that I've done, in terms of special education, but also technology. I've been involved with assistive technology and educational technology for many, many years, helped to found an assistive technology center in 1991 here in Rhode Island. So UDL, technology, special needs, and just differing learning methods all kind of blend together. And now I'm retired from full-time work, but I work as a consultant. And most of the work I do now is talking with people and helping to design instruction around UDL and the other aspects that go along with that. So that's kind of how I got into it. And I'm still even though I'm retired, I'm still working. I think that's what educators do. We just
Very, very hard.
Very true. Very true.
and I've known Susie for, I don't know, about 10 plus years.
Mhm.
Known Marcia for maybe 7 years, maybe something like that. I was on her PhD review committee, and I've known Boris fewer years, but since we became friends, you know, through the book. So I'll let Susie tell you more about that.
Yeah, Susie, why don't you tell us how you got in the field and how the book evolved, and then we'll get to Marcia and Boris and about their contributions. But give us the overview.
Yeah, sure. So I met Betsy through the International Society for Technology and Education. And there is a special interest group that was called Special Education Technology Special Interest Group, SETSIG. And it's since been renamed to the Inclusive Learning Network. And so we were colleagues through that. And she encouraged me to take a leadership role within that organization. And I served as president. Because she you know made the ask, and I had been part of that board for quite a while, so it was nice to have that nudge. And the Inclusive Learning Network, or SETSIG, before it was renamed, had a playground, an interactive session in the annual conference in the summer that they focused on UDL. They called it even the UDL playground, and that's where I was introduced to UDL. Was in a very much experiential way through the playground, and then eventually volunteering in the playground and speaking to the playground and so on. But that's where I was first introduced to it. And it made a lot of sense to me because my background is initially being dual certified in specific learning disabilities in elementary education, and then going into educational technology coordination. But I was very much still interested in supporting diverse learners in the coordinator positions that I held at the middle school level, and then at a small college in Kentucky. And, you know, how could we use technology to reduce barriers for learning? And then seeing UDL, how could we design strategically from the outset to make it so that everybody has opportunities to access the curriculum and to engage in the experiences and to show what they're learning through the process. So it really did resonate with the background that I had and what I was interested in. And so through the ISTE Inclusive Learning Network, Betsy and I headed up a subgroup that had a very much international focus with our colleague, Dr. Cindy Anderson of Roosevelt University. And we did several events every year through that, where we held webinars and other kinds of working sessions, and really expanded our network around the world through that. And we started thinking, you know what, people may not say UDL in some parts of the world, but they're doing things that are very much like UDL. And we couldn't find a whole lot of references that talked about this, that brought those global conversations together in a single resource. And so we said, well, maybe we need to put this together ourselves. And then with your nudge, Kurt, we decided to pitch it to Routledge, and that's how it all got started. I guess it was about 4 to 5 years ago now that we decided to move forward with it, and so here we are.
And so, yeah, I think I should join the Rutledge staff. I'm getting them all sorts of books. I'm working on one now myself. I think Chris wants to jump in here. Chris?
Well, this is a field that has an interesting challenge in framing, it seems to me. And I've been watching this over the decades. So special needs is accurate about many of the people that this field helps. And it also indicates the kind of specialized expertise that many people need to work in it. But it's also sort of a deficit framing. at least in the minds of the public. And then inclusive is better because it's now less of a deficit framing and it's more about having a big tent. But we're not quite to where I think we should be in terms of saying that everybody has special needs. And, you know, people have jagged edges. And so universal design for learning, universal is really the key word. I think that that's how my former colleague David Rose thinks about it, because he says, if you design for everybody at the margins, you automatically get everybody in the center.
Mhm.
And so it's always a challenge when we have a course, we have a course in our master's program on UDL, and I have to say to my advisees, this isn't just about designing for some small group of students who are outside the norm. This is about designing. And when we have an SLL program, you know, you have to kind of say to people, don't think that if you don't have an interest in special needs, that this is something that you shouldn't do. So do you have thoughts about that? First, would you agree with that framing? And then do you have thoughts about how we can make this sea change in how the field is viewed?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, Chris. I absolutely agree with you. And even though I come from a background in special education, I feel that it's a continuum. And I've always tried to approach that with technology, assistive technology and educational technology. It's a continuum, and learning is a continuum too. And I think the key here is the focus that, CAST has taken recently in talking about variability, systematic variability, and that there are variables that exist in everyone, and that when we can identify, but they follow a specific pattern, and the pattern is identified within the Universal Design for Learning framework, because it's based in neuroscience. And so when we can follow that framework, which really taps into that variability, then we can put together our design that integrates the variation. And that is the key. It integrates and broadens the variation in terms of the engagement that we use, in terms of the way that we represent information as educators, and the options that we have, for doing that. And technology plays a big role in that as well. Not the only role, though. It can be done. UDL can be done without, well, in the broad definition of technology, low tech is, any tool. So it can be done with low tech tools and high tech tools, but and then also the way that students respond. So by integrating all of those variables, we do broaden the tent, right? And if we think of the old, bell curve, right, and a standard deviation in the middle, I've used this, visual for a while, that, UDL, what it allows us to do is to come all the way over towards the edges of the curve. And it's questionable as to whether there will be some people that you're not going to be able to design for everyone kind of at the edges, or not. I mean, that's part of the argument that people are having. But what we can, with the UDL framework, really broaden this scope of individuals who are addressed through the design, through intentional design.
Do any of the three, Marcia or Susie or Boris, want to add to what Elizabeth has said? Because this is a big question that Chris has asked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I was reflecting on what Chris was saying, and I wouldn't say that's special education, neither inclusive education. I think that the real concept about UDL is education, good education, because it has a focus in how we face barriers that are in the context. It's a focus about what happens in the context. So through that way, through that scope, we can fix many of the issues that the current education has. I was reading an article of OECD, which was mentioning that one of the best predictors of good results of education is your family income. And that's not something that's allowable. Because many people has barriers because of the social and current incomes. Not only that, you have barriers or the education system segregates you because of your income, because of your gender, because of your abilities or disabilities, because of your migration situation, and so on. You have many other things in which the education system is failing. And UDL has the invitation to have this, because of this universal thing, because of this universal focus, it actually erase all of the segregation issues that the current education has.
Marcia, you look like you wanted to jump in there. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, and I mean, I want to, just say you would all know the history of South Africa, and so since about 1994, we're talking about, 26, 27 years ago, we've had so many inequalities, given our sort of systemic racism and colonialism and all of that. So 26, 27 years ago, in a democratic South Africa, are now trying to level out the playing fields. So there's a lot of inequalities, systemic inequality that still sits in the system, the legacy of that. So you can imagine, how do we address all the barriers? And we have lots of barriers, it's physical, it's economic, it's social, it's psychological, it's educational, it's how people learn, how learners learn, neurological differences, visual differences, hearing differences. I mean, like, we just all lie on a continuum of variability, everyone. So it was really, and I see UDL as sort of a way of, speaking to that variability in people and trying to level the playing fields, trying to actually meet people where they are, meet students where they are. So if students are struggling with writing, for example, with reading, how do we then play to their strengths? So it really is, for me, a strength-based approach. So if it's better, if a student is much comfortable and stronger verbally, orally, prefers to speak or say what they understand, then, that's what we need to work with, instead of focusing on the deficit and the barriers and the difficulties. Whether art is the mode and the medium through which a student can communicate and understand and learn and, express information, then that would be. So for me, UDL presents an opportunity, to address that massive variability and to start to level those playing fields in a sense. And to really speak to people's strengths. So we still have a long way to go. You can imagine all the barriers we need to work through. And we're still very much in early days. So my chapter is really just about conceptually, how can UDL be that one way that we can look at, or that lens through which we can look to level the playing fields.
Susie or Elizabeth, can we get a commitment that if anyone wants the chapter from Marcia or Boris, they can have it? Do you have this readily available that we could send their chapters? We will not tell Rutledge.
And both Susie and I have chapters too.
Yes, those too. So somehow we can try to make those available. Well, write to me or write to Susie, write to Elizabeth. Young wanted to jump in with a question.
I think we can get them right from the authors.
Okay.
Well, thank you. So, it's not a random question, but an invitation for you to explain to our general audience of UDL. You know, it's a hot topic. You know, if you know CAST, I know CAST quite well. I know the people in special ed well. So we've heard a lot about UDL. And if you were explaining, but again, I want to say probably 90% of people, educators, don't know what UDL is. So if you were going to give, let's say, a 2-minute description to make people who are listening to our show, a lot of them are not necessarily in special education, to say, so what is UDL? Can anyone jump in to make a quick explanation so we can talk more about it?
I think we'll hand this over to you, Susie.
So I don't know if it's going to be that clean and quick and easy, because I've learned through the book and through my international collaborations that UDL is interpreted a spectrum of ways, which is, I guess, is very UDL-ish. And so I see some people who would define UDL as a philosophy. And it is this assumption that we can design education and deliver education in a very universal way, and it is a right for all to be able to access that education. And so they will talk about things related to that philosophical, those philosophical underpinnings. And then there are others that interpret UDL in a very much practical, pragmatic application way. They see the framework as a curricular design framework, and they go through the checkpoints. They go through the principles, the guidelines, and the checkpoints, and try to meet those, you know, even check them off within a body of curriculum, and say, we need to check all the boxes in order for this to be considered UDL. So I've seen that end of the spectrum as well. And I'm not in a position to judge, to say that, you know, it should be one end or the other, but I find myself in the middle, I think. And whereas I can understand the philosophical underpinnings, and I'm very much aligned with that. And I see the value of the framework, although I don't necessarily feel like I need to check all the boxes every time. It doesn't work with all of the courses and instruction that I am designing and delivering myself. So, but there are things that I draw from the framework that inform my design and that help challenge me as a designer and as a teacher to broaden my perspective about what my learners need and how I can be more strategic about opening up and incorporating flexibility into the design so that it reduces potential barriers, or that it plans for options that are going to meet the diverse learner needs. And that has been particularly valuable in the pandemic this last year and a half. And so I've seen UDL not so much in conversations about supporting students with disabilities as it is supporting students through the pandemic this last year and a half. And how can we support people with differing needs through expanded flexibility in our designs and our teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot to mention, this is why Susie won the standing, what is it, the Distinguished Award, Innovation and Instructional Technology Award 2 weeks ago from the University of Houston. You can tell in her answer why she was the recipient. So congrats on that too. Sorry, Young.
I have a follow-up to that. So when you are teaching a group of students with UDL, do you start by understanding your students, or do you assume there is one set of universal guidelines or one universal framework you can apply to any students, any setting?
I think that the answer is that you have to be aware of what happens within your classroom. You have to be very flexible. That's probably the most important focus. Depending on what happens, you are going to take decisions on what will be your next step. So you have to know how you can get feedback from your students, and you have to know what's the way they communicate to you. You have to know what are their backgrounds. You have to connect. You have to be communicated. You have to feel what's going on with your students. That's the way I interpret and use UDL.
All right, I won't continue because I can have an interesting debate with you, and I love debating. And it's not that I don't like UDL. I just think, I love to have this conversation, but I won't let other people jump in.
Yeah, I have a couple of things I'd like to add here, kind of picking up, where blending what Boris is saying with some of the things that Susie was saying, and having taught many teachers done quite a bit of teacher training in universal design for learning. There's some key things. I mean, UDL is based upon the brain and how the brain learns, and the three core principles, which are really the heart of universal design for learning, come from that. Multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression. And there's a whole bunch of guidelines and checkpoints and everything like that. But in order to, one of the questions that was suggested to address was, how do we do like good UDL? Like, do you have to do everything? And Susie started to talk about that, and really thinking about the framework and how a teacher would apply it. I always recommend, find the greatest need, which is kind of where Boris was, and look at the framework and start from there. So if the issue is engagement, start there. You don't have to do every single point of, within the UDL framework, which can be found, a lot of information can be found on the CAST website, for your listeners. But you don't have to address everything all at once. And we never do. When we're trying to implement new things, we need to kind of work with the areas that are of the greatest need and of the greatest need for our students. So, working with those and then building out from there. And we also find that many of the variables that we bring into our design of our education bridge between different areas of UDL. So it might be something that addresses engagement, but it also helps to broaden representation. So there are many times you'll do something and it really might help all of the three, principles, for universal design for learning. So that's just one thing. And then the other thing I wanted to do is get back to what Susie was talking about, that UDL, a philosophy and a framework. And most recently, Susie and I have worked with another colleague to start thinking about the possibility of UDL really being an instructional design theory. When we take a look at UDL and the essence of UDL, and we take a look at the definition of instructional design theory, there is a great match. I mean, it really, fits many of the key components of instructional design theory. And so we just started to do some writing on that and some thinking about that. And I think that there's going to be some future in thinking about that. And then that might bring us to a different place for UDL in terms of where it would fit within the field as an instructional design theory.
I think there's a question.
Stay tuned for more.
I'm sorry, Betsy. There's a question, a comment really from Punya,
Yep.
one of our co-hosts. That's worth thinking about, is that how do you prevent UDL from becoming prescriptive? I think when Susie was talking about as a philosophy, I think in general, it's always a good idea. But how do we prevent it? And I've seen UDL done in a very prescriptive way.
I think the essence is to really understand the core nature of UDL and where it comes from, and not just as a bunch of checkpoints, right? Is to really understand, where it fits within the process of learning and those core principles. So that's why I always, come back to the principles themselves, and then and work from there. And then I think, well, also, and Susie, you might want to comment on this, the way that CAST has reorganized them with access and build and internalize, that can help people to think through universal design for learning in a progressive and kind of a more comprehensive way.
Yeah, certainly. And if you look at the progression, the vertical orientation of UDL through that access, build, and internalize those layers, it gets to these goals of learners being self-regulated and they're expert learners in essence. And so I want to speak to this focus that we may hear about, it being a front-loaded curricular design framework where the designer, the teacher is thinking about strategic flexibility and trying to incorporate that from the front end of the design. The focus really of UDL in action is not so much on what the teacher or what the designer is doing, it's what the students are doing. And so you'll see a lot of constructivist social learning happening within classrooms and instructional experiences that have been intentionally designed to have this strategic flexibility and this engagement such that learners can be self-regulated, that they can be expert, that they have the resources at their fingertips to learn in the best way that works for them. And so it's not so much about the teacher, it is very much student or person centered. I see in the examples of UDL in action.
I know Chris wanted to jump in about 10 minutes ago with a follow-up to his earlier. So Chris, you want to jump in?
Well, I really like this discussion, and I think that any theory of instruction and any theory of design ultimately goes back to philosophical ideas about what learners are. And the old adage about learners are not vessels to be filled, they're lamps to be ignited, has always made sense to me. And I think it is in fact consistent with modern neuroscience that everyone is gifted. Everyone has something special to contribute, but sometimes those gifts are trapped by what we inherit biologically, or they're trapped and suppressed by what society has done to us. And so the role of the teacher becomes to unlock that, as Marcia said, to start with the strength and then figure out how you help the child express the strength. And I think that UDL done without that philosophy, and I don't think it is. I think the field has that philosophy. That's why you're seeing constructivist learning approaches. But when UDL is done by people who thinks that learners are vessels to be filled, and they're just busy widening the mouth of the vessel so you can cram more facts in, that's where UDL turns into something that has the weaknesses of every other instructional strategy that makes that assumption. So that's, sorry about the sermon. There might have been a question in there somewhere, but it was well concealed.
Thank you, Chris. I didn't go to church today. I needed that.
Well,
But Kurt, I will add a question to Chris' comments. So this is the real question. There's a lot of new approaches, well, not really new since John Dewey, since actually everybody's talking about child-centered approach, new ways, student ownership, student self-determination, a personalized learning. So we have all these phrases. So if we ask you to think about, again, I won't tell you this, I'm a supporter of UDL, okay, but I'm going to ask you this question though, however, what about, what's the difference and the connection between, let's say, personalization of learning and UDL? That is, personalization is you let students, their strength, their passion to lead their learning, and they become owners of their own learning. And how do they connect?
I think,
You go ahead,
Betsy.
Boris.
Okay,
No,
thank you.
Boris, go first.
I think the importance here is the relationship, because from my perspective, UDL makes or strengthens the relationship between the learner and the educator. It is based on a philosophy in which the learner should be empowered, but he or she is actually coached, is trained by someone that has another perspective to help him, her to achieve the goals. That's how I think it is connected, but it's not actually the same thing of personalized learning, because you have this relationship not only between those two guys, the teacher, educator, and the learner, but also as a community. I think that's how they can achieve goals either as community and also as a single person.
Marcia, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I like that. I like what you're saying, Boris, about, the person within community, because our students come from context, and they come from a range of contexts. And so if we're looking at the student, within how the student identifies himself from gender perspective, from race, from religious perspective, there are so many perspectives. How they connect to the community. We speak about indigenous knowledge systems. So that person comes to the classroom with a whole range of experiences, and it's also individual. And so I think it's important, that gets acknowledged and that gets spoken to. And so in interaction with that, there's a comment about the social model, for example. So, we speak about the social model saying that how does the person in interaction with the environment, which is very broad. It's in that space that, that learning happens, that acknowledgement happens, that recognition happens, So I really see UDL working within that space and there are just so many ways in which you can express information. But people will have strengths, in terms of, or would have preferences in terms of how they prefer. So we've seen, for example, during the pandemic, that some students actually loved the fact that they could express themselves in other ways now, so it wasn't only that assessments could be done differently, you could do an assignment for your assessment, you could leave a voice note for your assessment or whatever it was. So there were various ways in which they could express themselves, except in just only, like it was done before. So, that really brought out the fact that we could look at different ways. Some students, in terms of the technology that they didn't have access to, they found other creative ways of actually doing that. So it's really about the context. It's the person in context that is so important, and how that interacts with, the educational system.
And I have a couple of thoughts I'd just like to add on this, Kurt, as I usually do. From UDL in the context, but UDL really is about, the creation of a learning environment that brings in the planning of variation, right? So within that, it can address a number of different contexts, but also within that, it can help to create a learning environment within whatever context it is in order to be able to better personalize learning. So that gets to your point, Young, is the relationship between UDL and personalized learning. But this is an issue that I struggled with when I was back in my fellowship, thinking about all the other things I knew, differentiated instruction and multiple intelligences and everything like that. And really, I thought that through, and I see UDL, and I have, I've talked about this, I have some graphics about this, UDL really kind of as an umbrella that can help us to address all of those things. If you think about, multiple intelligences and how they might be addressed, you can look to the UDL framework and say, oh, I can see here how I can do things now, the adjustments I can make, the things I can bring into my design in order to facilitate the learning of an individual who might learn that way. So to create that broader learning environment, and that's really where I see it. So it creates a big tent. UDL creates that big tent, and it going back to the simplicity of those three principles, that they are really the key to being able to think about how to do all of those things.
I have a question, but first of all, I want to encourage you to create an instructional design model, because I don't like any that exist currently. Before COVID, I shouldn't say we, the Dean's Office at Indiana University made funds available to fly Susie up to talk to our faculty about UDL. And they wanted to do that because we put a lot of programs online, a lot of new certificates, a lot of what called nano degrees, a lot of new doctoral degrees online. And they don't want a lawsuit, right, against them from the various learners out there. Since COVID, have you, because Marcia touched on this, she mentioned COVID and how people have been coming to her for advices. Have you seen an attitudinal change towards UDL since COVID? And if so, do you think that will continue post-COVID? What is your views of this time period for the field of UDL, and how do you look at the progression of it during the past year and a half, and where do you see the future lie? And anyone want to jump in on that?
I'll start. So yes, I have seen UDL, and you have seen UDL in the literature, in professional blog posts and articles. UDL is I've seen it at high flex as well, right? A lot in the last year and a half, but UDL is another thing that people are looking to as a way to navigate the complexities of the current pandemic. And we've seen connections between UDL and online instructional design for a while. And it is one of the things that I also saw connections even before COVID, when I was expanding programming in Kentucky to rural areas through online courses. And how could we address anticipate and address potential barriers to accessing education, and UDL can help me as a designer and as an educator to do that effectively. So yes, in COVID, I'm seeing UDL come up in higher ed and pre-K-12, even in medical education, health science education. I had an article in the Journal of Surgical Education last summer about some changes that they were making here in the Texas Medical Center to continue surgical education in this time of social distancing and just not being able to do it in person as they had in the past. And so I worked with one of the surgical educators here to draw from Universal Design for Learning and to make some changes in May that were able to help them continue through the pandemic. So yeah, I'm seeing it a lot, and I would hope that it would stick around, or at least, some of the things about this more open mindset about flexibility and the different ways that people can demonstrate what they're learning, and being creative as a designer, and how we can provide options for people to engage in an experience and to acquire the material, to represent the material in various ways. So I would hope that we would retain those even when the constraints of the pandemic go away, whenever that does happen.
Looks like Boris wants to jump in, and after Boris, maybe Marcia wants to comment too. So go ahead, Boris.
Thank you. Well, it's UDL, it's about how you erase barriers. COVID actually has set a lot of barriers to students, and that's why I think the UDL approach helps to erase these barriers. As an example, I told you that I work in an institution called Fellow Group. We are located in Chile, but after this pandemic, we had the opportunity to work with institutions in Peru, in Spain, in Argentina, in Colombia, eliminating these barriers just due to the fact that we could explore in a broader and a deeper way how technologies can help us to get these things solved. So I think that having, as Susie said, having this more flexible approach, more flexible mindset about how you will design your classes, you of course will have more answers to to the issues that COVID has set to the education system.
So yeah, regarding the question, post-COVID and how would it stay? Would we see more that flexibility that we saw during COVID? And I mean, I'm seeing from where I sit. So I work in student support. I'm not in an educator in the sense of teaching and in being in the classroom. But we do get asked our opinions, from time to time from the teaching and learning people, JP, Bosman, and Van der Merwe that Kurt referred to earlier on. So, so they do listen to us, we give them information and our inputs and so on. So one of the things that I've picked up in one of our faculties now that we're in 2021 was something that started during the pandemic, and well, we're still with the pandemic, but during last year. And so our faculty of engineering, which is one of the more sort of very conservative faculties, regarding how things must be done. Not very flexible, but they brought in, like all faculties generally last year, brought in the whole idea of extra time. So students were given extra time on assessment. So that was sort of seen as quite a flexible thing, But at the time they said, well, we're giving you flexible time or more time. Sometimes they even gave 24 hours for an assessment or 48 hours, or a quiz would be extended. Or if something had to be uploaded, for example, they would give extra time. But the main motive, well, in many cases, the motivation was to accommodate for the technology. So, for example, it takes a while sometimes to upload a question paper or download a question paper and then upload your answers. So many faculties were saying, well, we'll give extra time to allow for the technology. So they would give an extra half an hour, for example, just to accommodate for technology and things that could go wrong. But then some faculties are very flexible and saying 24 hours, it's sort of an open book assessment and so on. So we find a lot of that happening. Now we see that one faculty, I'm staying with the engineering faculty, have kept this the extra time. But now that what they're saying is that we will continue with extra time for everybody. So it's a universal approach, but then they motivate it by saying it's also to do with technology. So if you're doing online assessments, it's to accommodate for that. What the other students were saying that we're actually getting extra time, you know, we've got an official process where students can apply for extra time because they might be slow processes in terms of writing, or they might be physically have fine motor difficulties with writing and so on, or dyslexic and whatever. So those students were in a system where they were getting extra time anyway. So those students were saying that, you know, we still need our extra time above the universal extra time, because universal extra time is just given to accommodate for the technology. So, you know, over and above that. So that was a little bit of a battle that we were saying, no, but, you know, then those students will still get extra time. That's in cases where it was just a half an hour or so. So, you know, there's been sort of that plan. So in terms of the flexibility, we find, you know, that people are saying, well, flexibility, but for technology, not necessarily, you know, because that's sort of, you know, how we're going to necessarily do it going forward. So it's a bit of a difficult thing to say in terms of, you know, going forward, what's going to stay, what practices will remain, and so on. And then I also want to say UDL is not by any means widespread in our institution. You know, we speak a little bit to our teaching and learning people. There is documentation around for lecturers to use, but, you know, I'm not convinced that people are really using it. Here and there, I am aware that it's been done, but sort of more in a teaching way. So in our Faculty of Education, we, you know, lecturers are speaking about it to the teachers that they are training. So it's, as I said, my paper is really looking at the prospects of universal design for South Africa. So it's sort of more conceptual, looking forward at, you know, how can this benefit us? So it's not really something that's widespread in practice at this stage.
Thank you for that. And we put both links in the YouTube, so people have that available to them. They might be wondering a bit why Susie's talking about medical education. The University of Houston has a heavy emphasis, a lot of medical people in the area, in the Houston area, and they have a special master's program for doctors and medical professionals and a couple certificates and whatnot. And they have a brand new medical school at the University of Houston. So there's a lot, huge medical influence. And so Susie's heavily involved with that. Young wants to ask a question.
Well, thank you. This is, you know, I can't believe we're already coming to an end. I was just very interested in this topic. I think as you know, COVID has created really almost like a universal social experiment. That's what Punya's term is, that university have been doing this. And UDL as one of the, you know, what I call instructional approaches, instructional design approaches. By the way, Kurt, I never liked instructional design anyway. So that was, it's the teach and learning process should always be a dynamic process. You make them as you go along anyway. So that was pre-designed things. I never liked them. But anyway, so I was just wondering, with this great book, you got over 90 authors, you got so many people, and it's a thick book. And so how are you going to promote UDL globally? And what are your plans? You know, and I'm sure UDL is going through major changes by itself. I'm sure you have different people within UDL who have different opinions. I'm sure, you know, CAST no longer owns it anymore, you know, all this. I was just wondering about in the writing of the book, what did you get out of it? And the second of all, where do you think the book will take UDL to?
Can I just lead off around that? It's not just this book. There are several other books that are focused on UDL in higher education that was written by colleagues, and there's a number of other books coming out. But in addition to that, UDL is being recognized. One of the key places it's been recognized in is through UNESCO and the Sustainable Development Goals and their GEM report that they did last year, the 2020 GEM report that references UDL like 15 times within that report. So people that pay attention to those types of things, which is a lot of people around the world, read that And that really drives the whole question of what is UDL? And that's an easier question to answer than that. And how do I implement UDL? So we're kind of at that space. A lot of people are asking, you know, around the world, maybe they've heard about the book that we did or other books or in this GEM report and everything, but there's a lot of conversation now. We just started a new organization called the Include Collaboratory, which is an international organization that is involved with bringing together educators from around the world to have conversations around inclusive instruction and also universal design for learning. And when I stop speaking, I'll post the website up in the chat bar for everyone. But I think that there are a lot of things that are going on internationally with relation to UDL, and that's going to drive UDL's, you know, the discussion around UDL and where does it fit within the field of education. People are just asking a lot of questions right now. Some of them are driven.
Who else wants to jump
COVID
in? Go
as
ahead.
well. Yep. Some of them are driven by COVID. I think COVID drove us into the natural process of thinking about UDL because people were seeking something. And like Boris said, one of the things they found was UDL that might have some answers to how we can do things differently. The question was, how can I do stuff differently? I have to be working in this environment. I never did it before. You know, my students need to be working there. And so UDL was one of the things that they found that might have some answers. And I think that it did, and it does.
Anyone want to jump in on that? We only have a couple minutes left, so would anyone like to make a comment about that? We've got a number of audience questions that have come in, and there's so many that I'm wondering which one we should ask, but we have one here who's asked a couple. Priyank Sharma from India wonders, when we talk about UDL, there's so much focus on the teacher. In one of the most inclusive classrooms he saw, it was more about acceptance among students. It was more about UDLT, Universal Design for Learning Together. Does anyone have a comment on that?
I thought that UDLT was a beautiful way to put it, and we've seen other similar frameworks like UD4L that kind of rise up out of varied contexts around the world. So yeah, I definitely think that you do see the student orientation, the social learning in UDL classrooms. I want to throw it to you real quick, Boris, because one of the things that you talked about in your chapter that was so enlightening to me was how UDL was actually mentioned in the decree there in Chile. And so your chapter took a critical stance about how that was being interpreted and implemented there in Chile. So did you want to share just a minute on that?
Yeah, we got about a minute left for us.
Yeah, the chapter actually is decaffeinated UDL. It's not the actual one or the real one, because there was a misinterpretation of what UDL was, and that happens when that happens. It makes a mess actually when you're trying to implement that, and you have to unlearn whatever you have learned before. And that's why it is so important to actually set what UDL means for everyone. It's about the learners, it's about the learning. It's not about it is less about the teacher. So it is quite important to understand actually how UDL should be implemented, should be told. And more importantly, I think this discussion about the philosophy that's behind or in the base of what UDL is. it is really important that that's what I want to tell.
I only have a final comment before we transition to Chris to talk about the next show. It's just, we never read the title of this book. If anyone wants to get the book, it is called Universal Access Through Inclusive Design, International Perspectives on UDL by Susie Grunstedt and Elizabeth Betsy Dalton. So I want to thank Elizabeth and Betsy for coming to the show today, and along with Marcia and Boris. We've had a really entertaining time and a really informative time from all of you. I learned a lot of new things, and people in the chat in the YouTube window are have a real intensive conversation going on there too. So we hit the right topic this week. And again, thank you all for coming. And Chris now will introduce our next show.
So next week, episode 60 will be at 11:30 a.m. EDT, so not the standard 5:30 p.m. time. And we will have a couple guests who are very involved with international higher education. So they have a big picture view of a lot of the really interesting innovations that are happening in higher education internationally. And beyond that, they're very interested in policy and practice for the global common good. So how do we not only think about higher education institutions as helping their own students, but how do we think of them collectively as advancing the global common good? So I'm excited about the episode and hope that you'll join us.